Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Chapter 2. The Humors and Dispositions of Laputans Described. An Account of their Learning, of the King and his Court. The Author's Reception there. The Inhabitants subject to fear and disquietudes. An Account of Women. At my alighting I was surrounded by a crowd of people, but those who stood near seemed to be of better quality. They beheld me with all the marks and circumstances of wonder. Neither, indeed, was I much in their depth, having never till seen a race of mortals so singular in shape, habits, and countenance. Their heads were all reclined either to the right or the left, one of their eyes turned inwards, and the other directly up to zenith. Their outward garments were adorned with figures of the sun, moon, stars, interwoven with those of fiddles, flutes, harps, trumpets, guitars, and many more instruments of music, unknown to us in Europe. I observed here that many of the habits of servants, with a blown bladder fastened like a flail to the end of a short stick, which they carried me in their hands. In each bladder was a small quantity of dried peas or pebbles, as I was afterward informed. With these bladders they were now then flapped with mouths and ears of those who stood near them, of which practice I could not then conceive the meaning. It seems the mind of these people are so taken up with intense speculations that they neither speak nor attend the discourses of others, without being ruses by some external taction upon the organs of speech and hearing, for which reason those persons who are able to afford it always keep a flapper, the original is Clymnol, in their family, as one of their domestics, nor ever walking abroad or make visits without him. And the business of this officer is, when two or more persons are in company, gently to strike with his bladder the mouth of him who is to speak, in the right ear of him or them to whom the speaker addresses himself. This flapper is likewise employed diligently to attend his master in his walk, but upon occasion to give him a stop flap in his eyes, because he is always so wrapped up in cogitation that he is manifest danger of falling down every precipice, bouncing his head against every post, the streets, or jostling others, or being jostled himself into the kernel. It was necessary to give the reader this information, without which he would be at the same loss with me. To understand the proceedings of these people, as they conducted me up the stairs, at the top of the island, from thence to the royal palace. While we were ascending, they forgot several times what they were about, and left me to myself, till their memories were then roused by their flappers, for they appeared, although unmoved by the sight of my foreign habit and countenance, by the shouts of the vulgar, whose thought and minds were much more disengaged. At last we entered the palace, and proceeded into the chamber of presence, where I saw the king seated on his throne, attended by each persons of prime quality. Before the throne was a large table filled with globes and spheres, and the mathematical instruments of all kinds. His Majesty took not the least notice of us, although our entrance was not without sufficient noise. By the concourse of all persons belonging to court, but he was then in a deep problem. When we attended at least an hour before he could solve it, there stood by him, on each side, a young page, with flaps in their hands, and when he saw he was at leisure, one of them gently struck his mouth, and the other his right ear, at which he started like one awaked of a sudden, and towards looking towards me. And the company I was in recollected the occasion of our coming, whereof he had been informed before. He spoke some words, whereupon immediately a young man with a flap came to my side, flapped me gently on the right ear. I made the signs as well as I could, that I gave no occasion for such an instrument, which, as I afterward found, gave his Majesty in the whole court a very mean opinion of my understanding. The king, as far as I could conjecture, asked me several questions. The king, I addressed myself to him in all language I had, and it was found I could neither understand nor be understood. I was conducted by the king's order to an apartment in his palace, this prince being distinguished from all above his other procedures for his hospitality to a stranger, where two servants were appointed to attend me. My dinner was brought. Four people of quality, whom I remembered having very near the king's person, did me the honour to dine with me. We had two courses, of 3 dishes each. In the first course there was a shoulder of mutton, cut into an equilateral triangle, the beef into rhomboids, the pudding into forms of fiddles, sausages and puddings representing flutes and hausboys, and breast of a veal in the shape of a harp. The servants cut into our braids in cones, cylinders, parallelograms, and several other mathematical figures. While we were at dinner, I made bold to ask the names of several things in their language, and those noble persons, by the assistance of their flappers, delighted to give me answers, hoping to raise my admiration of their great abilities, if I could be brought to converse with them. I was soon able to call for drink and bread and whatever else I wanted. After dinner, my company withdrew. A person, sent to me by the king's order, attended a flapper, who was brought with him pen and ink and paper, and 3 or 4 books, giving me to understand by signs, which he sent to teach me the language. We sat together for 4 hours, in which the time I wrote down a great number of words in columns, with translations over against them. I likewise made a shift to learn several short sentences, for my tutor would order one of my servants to fetch something. To them, to make a bow, or to sit, or stand, or walk, and the like, I then took down a sentence in writing. He also shewed me, in one of his books, the figures of the sun, moon, and the stars, and the zodiac, and the polar circles, together with denominations of many other figures of planes and solids. He gave me the name and the description of all the musical instruments, and the general terms of art in playing on each of them. After he had left me, I placed all my words with their interpretations in the alphabetical order. Thus, in a few days, by help of a very faithful memory, I got some insight into their language. The word, which I interpreted from flying or floating island, is in the original Laputa, whereof I can never learn the single true etymology. Lap in the old obsolete language signified high, and unto a governor, from which they said by corruption of this derivation, but which seemed to be little strained. I ventured to offer to the learned among them a conjecture of my own, that Laputa was quasi-Lapt-outed, Lap signifying properly the dancing of sunbeams in the sea, and outed a wing, which, however, I shall not obtrude, but submit to the studious reader. Those to whom the king had entrusted me, observing how ill I was clad, ordered a tailor to come next morning, take the measure for a suit of clothes. This operator did in his offer at a different manner from those in his trades in Europe. He first took my altitude by a quadrant, then with a rule and a compass described the dimensions of the outline of my whole body, all which he entered upon a paper. In 6 days brought my clothes very ill made, quite out of shape, by happening to mistake the figure in calculation. But my comfort was regarded, that I observed such accidents very frequent and little regarded. During my confinement for the want of clothes, by an imposition that held me in some days longer, I was much enlarged by my dictionary, and when I went next to the court, I was able to understand many things that the king spoke, and returned to him some kind of answers. His Majesty had given orders that the island should move northeast and by east, to the vertical point over Lagado, metropolis of the whole kingdom below the firm earth. It was about 90 leagues distant, and our voyage lasted 4 days and a half. I was not in the least sensible of progressive motion made in the air by the island. On the second morning, about 11 o'clock, the king himself in prison, attended by his nobility, courtiers, and officers, having all prepared their musical instruments, played on them for 3 hours without intermission, so that I was quite stunned by the noise, neither had I could possibly guess the meaning till my tutor informed me that he said the people of their island had the ears adapted to hear musics of the zephyrs, which they always played at certain periods, and the court was now prepared to bear their part in whatever instrument they most excelled. In our journey towards Lagado, the capital city, His Majesty ordered that the island should stop over certain towns, villages, from whence he might receive the petitions of his subjects. And to this purpose several pack-threads were let down, with small weights at the bottom. Of these pack-threads the people strung their petitions, which mounted up and up directly like the scraps of paper fastened by schoolboys at the end of strings that hold their kite. Sometimes we received wine, victuals from below, which were drawn up by pulleys. The knowledge I had in mathematics gave me great assistance in acquiring their phraseology, which depended much upon the science in music. In the latter I was not unskilled. Their ideas are perpetually conversant in lines and figures. If they would, for example, praise the beauty of a woman or any other animal, they would describe it by rhombs, circles, parallelograms, ellipses, or other geometrical terms, or by the word of art drawn from music. Needless here to repeat, I observed in the king's kitchen all sorts of mathematical and musical instruments. After the figures at which they cut up the joints that were served to his Majesty's table. Their houses were very ill built, the walls bevel, without one right angle in any apartment. This defect ariseth from one contempt they bear to practical geometry, which they despise as vulgar and mechanic. In those instructions, they being too refined for the intellectual of their workmen, which occasion perpetual mistakes, although they are dexterous enough for a perpetual piece of paper. in the management of a rule. The pencil in the divider, yet common actions and behavior in life. I have not seen a more clumsy, awkward, unhandy people, nor so slow that their conceptions of all other subjects, except those of mathematics and music, they are very bad reasoners, and vehemently given to opposition, unless they happen to be one of the right opinion, which is seldom their case. Imagination, fancy, and invention, they are wholly strangers to, nor have any words in their language by which those ideas can be expressed. The whole compass of their thought and mind being shut up within the two forementioned sciences. Most of them, especially those who do deal in the astronomical part, have great faith in judicial astrology, although they are ashamed to own it in publicly. But what I chiefly admire and serve in them towards news and politics, perpetually inquiring into public affairs, giving their judgment in a matter of state, and passionately disputing every inch of a party opinion. I've indeed observed the same disposition among most mathematicians I have known in Europe, although I could never discover the least analogy between the two sciences, unless those people suppose that because of the small circle hath as many as degrees as the largest, therefore the regulation and management of the world require no more abilities than of handling and turning of a globe. But I rather take this quality to spring from a very common infirmity from human nature, including us to be more curious, conceited in matters which we have least concern, for we are less adapted by either study or nature. These people are under continual disquietudes, never enjoying a minute's peace of mind. Their disturbances proceed from causes which very little affect the rest of mortals. Their apprehensions arise from several changes they dread in the celestial bodies. For instance, that the earth, by continual approach of the sun towards it, must be in the course of time absorbed or swallowed up; that the face of the sun will by degrees be encrusted with its own effluvia, give no light to the world; that the earth very narrowly escaped a brush from the tail of the last comet, which would have infallibly reduced it to ashes; that the next, which they have calculated for in 1 in 30 years hence, will probably destroy us; for, if in its perihelion should approach within a certain degree of the sun, as by their calculations they have reason to dread, it will conceive a degree of heat 10,000 times more intense than that of red-hot glowing iron; and that in the absence of the sun, carrying a blazing tail 10,014 miles long, through which if the earth should pass at the distance of 100 miles from the nucleus or the main body of the comet, it must in its passage be set on fire, reduced to ashes; that the sun daily spent in its rays without nutriment to supply them, will at last be wholly consumed and annihilated, which must be attended with the destruction of this earth, and of all the planets that receive their light from it. They are so perpetually alarmed with the apprehensions of these and the like impending dangers, that they neither sleep quietly in their beds, nor have any relish of the common pleasures or amusements of life; and when they meet an acquaintance in the morning, the first question is about the sun's health, and how he looked at his setting and rising; in what hopes they have to avoid the stroke of this approaching comet. This conversation they are apt to run into this with the same temper that boys discover, in delighting to hear terrible stories of sprites and hobgoblins, which greedily listen to, and dare not go to bed for fear. The women of the islands have abundance of vivacity, and contemned with their husbands, are exceedingly fond of strangers, whereof there is always a considerable number of the continent below, attending at court either upon affairs of several towns, or their own particular occasions, and are much despised, because they want the same endowments. Among these ladies choose their gallants, but the vexation is that they act with too much ease and security. For the husband is always so wrapped in speculation, the mistress and lover may proceed to the gravest familiarities before his face, if he be but provided with paper and implements, without his flapper at his side. The wives and daughters lament their confinement in the island, although I think it is the most delicious spot of ground in the world. And although they live here in the greatest plenty of and magnificence, and are allowed to do wherever they please, they long to see the world, and take diversions of the metropolis. They are not allowed to do without any particular license from the king. This is not easy to be obtained, because people of quality have been found by frequent experience how hard it is to persuade their women to to return from below. I was told that a great court lady, who had several children, is married to the prime minister, the richest of his subject in the kingdom, a very graceful person, extremely fond of her, and the lives in the finest palace of Ireland went down to Lago, of the pretence of health. There hid herself for several months, till the king sent a warrant to search for her. She was found in an obscure eating house, all in rags, having pawned her clothes to maintain an old deformed footman, who would beat her every day. In those company she was taken much against her will, although her husband received her with all possible kindness, and without the reproach she was soon contrived to steal down again with all her jewels to the same gallant, and hath not been heard of since. This may, perhaps, pass the reader rather than more of European or English story that for one of a country so remote, he may please to consider that the caprices of womankind are not limited by any climate or nation, that they are much more uniform and can be easily imagined. In about a month I had made tolerable proficiency in their language, and I was able to understand most of the king's questions when I had the honour to attend him. His Majesty discovered not the least curiosity to inquire into laws, government, history, religion, or manners of the country which I had been, but has confined his questions to the state of mathematics. Received his account that I gave him, with great contempt and indifference, though often roused by his flapper on each side.